finally Friday. It's Friday, Friday.
Thank God it's
Welcome back to the Friday Show, presented this week by the Match Series, which resumes July 13th at Delaware Park. I'm Scott Jagow, glad to be joined by Joe Nevills, our Bloodstock editor, and glad you could join us. Coming up, we're going to get into that debate over synthetic racetracks versus dirt. But first, let's start with last week's decision by the Breeders' Cup to stay at Santa Anita after all that we've been through this year. Joe, what's your take on their decision?
Well, it's a really tough spot. We're basically in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation here because there are such serious and potentially industry-shaping pros and cons for either keeping it at Santa Anita or moving it to another location, such as Churchill Downs, which has been highly speculated. But keeping it at Santa Anita presents a situation where we could see the absolute best-case scenario or the absolute worst-case scenario. At the end of the day, we could have an event where we have every horse go back to the barns, sound as a pound, looking good, and we can point to that and say, see, the changes are working. California racing is in the right direction. You know, guys, maybe lay off a little bit, and things would be good. Or we could have, if a horse breaks down, multiple horses break down even, that could be something that could have drastic impact on the racing industry at large, reaching beyond just California, but onto a national scene. And it's a little bit of a gamble, but I think it's probably the right choice.
Yeah, if it's going to be equal, because if you think about it, I mean, Churchill Downs, their safety record isn't brilliant. I mean, they have a pretty high fatality rate themselves, so you're not moving it to a track that is proven safer by the data, for one thing. If you go to Churchill and there aren't any problems, then the fingers probably get pointed back to California and they say, it was a California problem all along, which isn't really reflective of the truth. The truth is that it's a national issue that needs to be addressed nationally. And then if it goes to Churchill and there are problems, breakdowns, then the outside scrutiny will say, well, I guess it wasn't just California. You guys have a bigger problem. So back to damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think in the end, if it's going to be that kind of situation, you probably stay with what you had already put into place and hope those protocols work. The Breeders' Cup has a pretty good record and their standards are high. And we're talking about high quality horses here. A lot of the breakdowns that have occurred have been at the lower levels.
But at the same time, the Breeders' Cup is far from immune from having breakdowns, and they're very high-profile races. A few years ago, we had Secret Compass was a good juvenile breakdown, on the racetrack. George Washington in the Classic several years ago was another one that ended up didn't making it off the track. So, it's still a bit of a risk to run Breeders' Cup races here, just because these are the highest level horses in the country, if not the world. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be made of oak when they put them out there, no matter what the surface is.
Yeah, that's true. Well, let's move on and talk about racing surfaces, because that's been part of the conversation here with what's happened at Santa Anita. Was it the rain? Is it the surface, the base, the dirt versus some of the safer synthetic surfaces? There was a really good article in the Louisville Courier-Journal by Tim Sullivan this week that talked to industry leaders about this issue. And, it's still divided. Some racetracks went from dirt to synthetic. We know that story, Keeneland and Santa Anita among them. Then they reverted back to the dirt. What do you think was the major driving force in going back to dirt from that synthetic experiment?
Well, I think there were a lot of different instances that caused the ultimate change to go back to dirt as an industry, but personally, I point to two races in particular. The two Breeders' Cup Classic races that were held at Santa Anita in 2008 and 2009, which the best performers in there, these are the types of races that are supposed to be potential stallion showcases, the kind of things that you can add to a resume and say, look, my horse won in the Breeders' Cup Classic, ran very well. And the horses that did well in those two races weren't ones that you typically would see headed to Kentucky with a lot of mares clamoring for them. I've got a list right here. So your top three in 2008 were Ravens Pass, European horse, Henry the Navigator, Euro, and Tiago, who eventually went to Kentucky, but not exactly one that breeders were lining up for. 2009, your winner was Zenyatta, filly, Giopani, who is best known as a turf horse, and twice over who was bred in Great Britain. So we have a bunch of horses that did well in these races and beat a lot of horses that went on to become notable Kentucky sires. And I think that just didn't sit well with the right types of people, that, these horses are coming out and beating us on the national stage, and that's making it harder to do their job.
So the breeding industry certainly could have put pressure either directly or indirectly on that decision. I agree that is totally possible, and I think that's a great pointing out there of those two races. So that is an issue. I think the horsemen also, they didn't like dealing with all the nagging injuries that they were having or they were complaining about, hind end and that kind of stuff. But again, the trade-off is catastrophic injuries, because synthetic surfaces empirically are safer. They are safer by the data than dirt. They're safer in 8 out of the last 10 years versus turf. So when you look at synthetic versus turf, they're safer, and certainly versus dirt. So it's the empirical data says that. In addition to the breeding and the horsemen, there was sort of this idea. I mean, the Keeneland CEO Bob Ellison said this. He said, we wanted to be relevant, and we were starting to be irrelevant by having a synthetic track. And by relevant, I mean everyone wants to win Triple Crown races, and those are all on dirt. And so owners and trainers didn't want to prep on a synthetic surface for a major dirt race.
And that's going to be something they're going to have to tackle until at least one of the three Triple Crown races decides, okay, we're going to run on synthetic, which I think is going to take a pretty monumental jump at this point. But it might be the kind of thing that at some point, if there's ever some sort of racing czar or centralized horse racing committee where if you have X number of graded stakes races, you should have a synthetic option on your racing surface. I certainly realize that not every track can afford to rip up its dirt surface and throw in synthetic, but I think if you're going to race at a certain level, look at a track like Woodbine, who has done very well with the Tapeta surface and has their big turf program, but the Queen's Plates run on synthetic. There are big races to be had there, and their breakdown rates are very good compared to the national average. I think there's a pathway to that for at least the higher level racetracks.
Yeah, I mean, the Tapeta surface has proven to be very safe around the world, and it's only at three racetracks in North America. And Michael Dickinson, the founder of Tapeta, I spent some time with him at his farm, and he showed me his test laboratories where they work on the mixtures of the surface. And he said, 19 times out of 20, it doesn't work. It fails. We have to start over from scratch. But that's the process. And that is the other big advantage of synthetics. They are continually being improved. The NFL does not run on AstroTurf anymore. Remember that surface that was hard as concrete, and even baseball players, the ball would bounce off of it. It was so hard, and the players complained. NFL players complained about they're getting scrapes and bruises. I think you said you even played on that.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned players complaining. Heck, I complained. I played on that a few times in school growing up, and it's basically like mini golf putting green. You bounce off it. Our team was ravaged afterward with concussions and scrapes, and I never wanted to do that again. And now we've made significant jumps further. They have things like field turf and things that are much truer to the grass experience, and the product is better for it, and the product is safer for it.
Right. So my point is, it's been 25 years or more that these surfaces have been developed. I remember at the World Cup in '94, they had grass growing indoors in Detroit, and that was kind of the first time I had seen it. And it's improved substantially since then. And the same thing can be said for racetrack surfaces that are synthetic. You can't really improve dirt. Dirt is dirt. Synthetic surfaces can be improved, and that, to me, along with the data, is a really strong argument for, I know it would take a long time, but to remake the industry as synthetic. But at the same time, the earlier synthetic experiment, come on, they didn't give it enough time. Just like a lot of things in this industry, they do takeout experiments, and then it doesn't work after a few months, and they're like, okay, we're done with that. Lots of examples of that in this industry.
And it takes a long time to make sea changes in the industry like that. Consider, going back to the breeding side, consider that. It takes a long time for the North American breed, which is primarily bred for dirt and speed, to adjust to a surface that's built more for, synthetic and not as much speed, and that takes several generations of breeding to, change a stallion program, change a racing stable to get the right kind of horses that are going to adjust to that. Back home in Michigan, I know a lot of people who ended up running at tracks in Michigan, no synthetic there, no turf there, dirt only, who ended up going to Presque Isle Downs when things closed down, and it took them a long time to adjust and figure things out, and now they're doing quite well for themselves. So it's just the kind of thing that takes time and probably going to take a lot of money, but if you get it done right, then you can succeed.
Yeah, and I guess the one other thing I want to mention is, this obviously would be a huge process to overhaul all of the racetracks, the major ones, to synthetic. And that doesn't solve the other issues behind this. It's not just about the surface.
Oh, of
because
course.
Fatalities still occur on synthetic tracks. It doesn't solve some of the breeding issues, breeding for speed instead of stamina, the drugs, the medication, the mismanagement of horses. None of that is being addressed by changing surfaces. So that needs to be pointed out. But if you're just talking about the racetrack and what can we do, are we doing everything possible to make it safer? It's hard to argue against synthetic.
It just seems like such a slam dunk.
Yeah. All right. Well, what do you think about this? We have a poll on our website. I'm sure we've asked this before, but it's probably been a few years. Should racetracks switch to synthetic versus dirt, given all the things that have been happening in recent months and the statistics that suggest synthetics are safer? Let us know at pollockreport.com. All right, that's going to do it. Thanks, Joe, for this edition of the Friday Show, presented by the Match Series, which picks up again July 13th at Delaware Park.